Yeah, so my name's Andrew Gruen. So about a year and a half ago, I embarked on a ridiculously massive journey that I did not fully understand at the time to document the history of nullsec. And I did so by launching a book on Kickstarter called, at the time it was called A History of the Great Empires of EVE Online, but then I realized that that's almost an entire tweet, so you really don't want to have your book have 140 characters in it. So we call it now Empires of EVE, A History of the Great Wars of EVE Online. And so, yeah, as Falcon said, that was an incredibly successful time, a really great Kickstarter. I can't thank you all enough for how well that went. And I started around FanFest putting together a presentation that tried to show people in about 20 to 40 minutes how the dominoes fell that brought us to the point of what we know of today as the Great War. And it's this incredibly interesting thing because you can take a look and there's three major events that happen that you can point to and you can say these are the moments, these are the individual moments that led to this incredibly large event happening, this 2-year-long conflict that involved over 50,000 people from around the world. It is, without a doubt, one of the most fascinating things that has ever happened on the internet, anywhere. And so we're working on right now getting that into a YouTube version that people can watch online. I've only done it in person so far. And so I didn't want to come here and just do that presentation, even though I love that presentation, because I didn't want to give you guys something that you can just watch online. So we're going to do something like the sequel to that, what happens after that presentation ends and the Great War actually begins. So the title of this is The History of the First Great War, and it's kind of hedging its bets because we call it the Great War, but at the time they split it into the First Great War and the Second Great War, and later we just realized it was all the same conflict. And even this is sort of laughably ambitious for a 20-minute presentation. We're going to actually be talking about maybe the first third of the First Great War, so really about 1/6 of what we know of today as the Great War. So let me catch up on my slides a little bit because I'm talking too much. Okay, so we're going to recap just a little bit. We're going to go, I want to get through as much as possible. We have so much to get through, but I want to recap just a little bit. As I said, it's about my previous presentation is about 3 major events that sparked the Great War. And so the first event was called the Siege of CJ6MT, in which the Russian alliances their old dominion had been captured by a coalition known as the Coalition of the South. And they had been pushed back to literally one last star-based defensive position. And they managed in this sort of spectacularly climactic Alamo-style battle to push back an army 5 times larger. And it is a wonderful event, and it is an event that convinces Goonswarm that they are an alliance that they need to ally with. And so Red Alliance convinces them through this spectacular performance in this battle to make an alliance, and then they also ally with a French alliance called Tau Ceti Federation. They become a force in nullsec known as Red Swarm Federation. So this is an event, a day in time that led directly to the formation of one of the great power blocks in the history of EVE Online. And so the next thing is the birth of the first Titan ever in EVE Online by the name of Steve, by the Alliance Ascendant Frontier. And so this is really important because the birth of this first Titan leads directly to an alliance known as Band of Brothers saying, we want to go kill this thing, so we're going to go invade Ascendant Frontier. And they are successful. They destroy Steve, and Ascendant Frontier falls into a failure cascade as a result. This is this incredibly climactic moment that we can see in history led to so many more important things. So Ascendant Frontier falls out of the galactic arena, and there's this power vacuum that becomes a huge problem later on. And so the third event is the Kugutsumen expose that sparked the T20 scandal, which turned all of nullsec against Band of Brothers. It basically, for anybody who isn't familiar with this event, it basically revealed that there was malfeasance going on with a member of Band of Brothers who was an employee of CCP who had been spawning blueprint originals into the game to create wealth for him and his alliance. And it seemed at the time to people who were in New Eden that it was the tip of the iceberg, and that there was so much more going on, and that Band of Brothers was the pet alliance of CCP Games, and we needed to rally against them to drive them out of nullsec forever. And this was sort of co-opted by the other nullsec leaders at the time because they saw one of their great enemies, Band of Brothers, was hated right now, and there was the political momentum to unite in a grand coalition to destroy them forever. And so the two other major powers at the time, Red Swarm Federation and the Northern Coalition, come into an alliance that is sworn to remove Band of Brothers forever. And so that's what that says. And so before we can kind of go in, we need to take a look at what nullsec looked like at the time. And so this is like super confusing if you've never looked at a SOV map before, but it's really quite simple. So all of these alliances, these blobs, Dusk and Dawn, Razor, Morsis Mihi, everything north of Pureblind is called the Northern Coalition. These are the individual alliances that make up the coalition of allies called the Northern Coalition. Over on the right-hand side, you see, what is that, CDC and Pure, and then Roadkill and Smash. This is basically the only coalition that will not come into play in this story in a really major way. They have their part to play, but it's not at the same level as the others. And so you have those maybe 7 or 8 blobs at the top, that's the Northern Coalition, and then you see the blue and yellow, Uwat and Rise. This is sort of the front line. These are Band of Brothers allies in the north. And that blue down on the bottom, that is the northern tip of Band of Brothers Empire. And they extend almost all the way to the north to the border of the Northern Coalition. So this is what the north looks like at the time. It's really interesting. You can look in right now and you can actually see the drone regions have just been introduced at this point, and barely anybody had ever even bothered to settle them yet. So this kind of gives you a timestamp of what was going on in this point in history. And so now we can warp down and we can take a look at the south of what's going on right now. That blue blob up on top, that is the northern tip of Band of Brothers Empire that you could see on the northerly map. And all of this blue on the left side, that is Band of Brothers Dominion. It is the largest empire that has ever been carved out in the history of EVE Online up to this point. And it's funny, you can actually see right there, that little purple thing between the blue and the green, that is the last few star systems of Ascendant Frontier that had not yet been rid of star bases, of star-based sovereignty. So you can see on this map, this historical signpost that Ascendant Frontier was basically being cleaned up off of the map. And over in the far east, you can see the big red. That is Red Swarm Federation. And Red Swarm Federation has been waging their war against the Coalition of the South. And the last standing member of the Coalition of the South is this green group right here, known as Lotka Volterra. And this is where our events really begin. This is where the action really starts. And so I realized when I put this presentation together that it probably would take me like an hour and a half to actually go through all the events that I wanted to talk to you about today. So I'm going to just like rush through this as fast as I can so we can get to some really cool material. Basically, Red Swarm Federation deposes all of the rest of the Coalition of the South. And all of those alliances that made up that coalition are gone except for Lotka Volterra. They are the last alliance standing. But they have one edge. They are a very, very strong industrial power, and they're very, very good fighters as well. They're very, like Band of Brothers is the military power, Ascendant Frontier was the industrial power, but Lotka Volterra was like the best of both worlds. So they were very formidable in their time. But Red Swarm is the swarm. They have manpower the likes of which nobody else can even dream of at this time. This was like the birthplace of where they really started to show off their manpower. And so what they've decided to do is take Lotka Volterra head on in one climactic battle, and they want to cut the head off the snake is how they would have said it. And so they rally all of the groups that they are allied with. They get every pilot that they can get their hands on, and they march them directly into Lotka Volterra's territory, because Lotka Volterra has one Titan that they've already used to incredible effect in a previous battle during this war with Red Swarm. Still today, I believe, the most destructive single moment in nullsec history. They used a Titan back when Titans Doomsday were AoE blasts, not single target, and they killed 217 ships with one single Doomsday blast, and still lost the battle. Such was the might of the swarm. They just went back to their carriers that were on the outskirts of the battle, reshipped, and came right back in and actually were able to take the field. And so now Red Swarm is very, very confident from that battle. They don't really even care about the Titan at this point, but they're very concerned because Lotka Volterra, they have learned, are building another Titan. And they're really worried about this now because if you have 2 Titans, that's a whole different story. And you're worried if they get 2 Titans, maybe they can safeguard a 3rd and a 4th and a 5th. Like what happens if they keep building them? And so they figure out where Lotka Volterra is building this sort of infant Titan. And they mass every pilot they can get their hands on into a system called JV1V Tech O. And it is like the must-attend gala of the season. Like everybody sees that Red Swarm is becoming a major power, and like every vassal who wants to get in on the ground floor of this new nullsec power, like shows up with every pilot they have just to be a part of this, just to be seen at this battle. And they show up with more than 1,000 ships. At this time, 2007, you did not get 1,000 ships in a fleet. This was a time when 200 versus 200 was an enormous battle. The servers could barely handle this kind of thing. And so Lotka Volterra knows this is coming, and they know this is a crucial battle, because this is a battle for morale. This is a battle that says, if we can just come into your backyard and destroy your flagship, how are you going to ever stop us ever again? Why would you even bother to resist? And so they get everybody they can get to this fight. And they've got about 500 ships to stand up to this. And so JV-1V is a backyard system. I believe it's in Tenerife. And it is a dead end. There's no other way into JV-1V except the one way in. I believe the system next to it is MRPN-3. And so they get 500 battleships, and they march it into that system, and they point every gun they've got directly at the starbase, or at the Stargate entry point of the system. And they've got an edge that they're planning. They've parked their Titan outside of JV-1V in MRPN-3 and hidden it there. And the idea is that when 1,000 Red Swarm ships show up, that Stargate is going to act as something like a toll booth, and that they're not going to all be able to get in at the same time. And so when half of the fleet gets in, they'll get liquefied by the 500-man battleship fleet. And then the Titan will show up and doomsday the rest of the fleet that's waiting at the gate. They'll all be clustered up, and they can do even better than 217 ships at once. And so Red Swarm shows up. I've got to get through this a little more quickly. Red Swarm shows up, and they all start piling into the gate, and Lotka Volterra is using their plan, and they loose the doomsday blast, and the server crashes. And so there was one thing that Lotka Volterra didn't know about what was happening here, is that Red Swarm had staged a logon trap inside JV-1V, and they were currently trying to log in. And so when the server crashed and there were 2,000 people trying to log in, the 300-person logon trap that was inside of JV-1V got in first through the login queue and destroyed the entire Lotka Volterra fleet without ever having any resistance whatsoever. The entire resistance of Lotka Volterra was destroyed without a battle. And this was the most discouraging possible thing, because how do you convince your pilots to show up to a battle that you're likely to lose against overwhelming resistance if you're not even going to get to fight the battle? If they're going to crash the server, and then you're not even going to get to do anything. And so I'm trying to keep this up here because so you guys don't have to stare at words. You can kind of get a sense of what this might have looked like on the map a little bit. But to kind of catch up here a little, and so Lotka Volterra is very closely allied, not very close, but loosely allied with Band of Brothers. And Band of Brothers should have probably been there to help them out in that battle, but they weren't, because they were already dealing with skirmish attacks inside of their territory. And they needed to, remember, all of New Eden was arrayed against Band of Brothers at this time, and they needed to safeguard all of their stuff before they could go help out any of their allies. And in order to do this, they needed to, let's see here. So anyways, Lotka Volterra falls as a result of the Battle of JV-1V. Their members get sort of despondent and don't want to fight anymore, and most of them go and join Band of Brothers. Crucially, Shinra Corporation, which owned Lotka Volterra's Titan, joins Band of Brothers. Now Band of Brothers has 2 Titans to work with. And so Red Swarm completes, this is like the capstone of their mission in nullsec, and they finally remove the Coalition of the South that had tried to exterminate the Russian presence in nullsec all this time. And while this is happening, the Northern Coalition that we talked about earlier has begun to move forces against Band of Brothers, because they realize all this else is happening, this is our moment to attack. And Band of Brothers is already dealing with its own attacks, and it can't afford to split its forces in 3 different directions. And so it hires a mercenary outfit that it's pretty closely related to, or allied with almost, called Mercenary Coalition, to head north and get control of the northern portion of this war. And so while all of the armies of the Northern Coalition are down south in Delve and Quarius trying to fight Band of Brothers on the front line, Mercenary Coalition goes up north, where there's nothing left but militia. And they bring their motherships with them. They bring their fine-tuned mercenary tactics. And there's a lot going on there, and Mercenary Coalition will probably get upset that I was going to glaze over this part so quickly, but Mercenary Coalition just obliterates the Northerners in their home and starts conquering the entire territory. But the Northern Coalition is kind of okay with this. They're like, we just have to do a tactical retreat, let them take over our territory while we're putting pressure on Band of Brothers in the south. But it doesn't really work. And the Northern Coalition is terribly hurt because of all of this. But they do survive, and they will come back in a great way later. And so, there's this one quote that I love that I wanted to share with you because I found this in Goonswarm's private history logs that shows you just how bad the situation was for the Northern Coalition. I won't read it, but you can go ahead and take a look at that. And so we're moving on. And Sir Mole, who is the leader of Band of Brothers, is so happy with Mercenary Coalition's success at this time. They are so happy with this, that this has been happening because they know that Red Swarm is planning to adopt the exact same tactic it used against Lotka Volterra to use that against Band of Brothers. They're going to, once again, try to cut off the head of their adversary before a real war starts to even take place. And Red Swarm, as I said, is planning this huge attack, and this is even bigger. This is even more important than the previous attack on Lotka Volterra, because you have to remember, it's a double-edged sword to say that Band of Brothers is the pet alliance, so to speak, of CCP games. It wasn't necessarily true, but this was the rumor. But it's a double-edged sword because, yes, everybody hated them because of that, but it also meant, why would we attack God's favored son, so to speak? What hope do we have of victory if the developers of the game are pulling the strings to make sure they win every time? And so Red Swarm had to win this battle because this was a proving ground. They needed to show that a war against Band of Brothers was achievable. And so they gain some intelligence, and they figure out that Band of Brothers is constructing its third Titan. This sort of like Titan proliferation doomsday theory is coming true, and they're getting their third. And they're building it in this system called F-TEIT. And so the same thing happens again. Red Swarm gathers this unbelievable fleet. This fleet that, again, it is the must-attend event of the season. All of the vassals show up to sort of like swear fealty, and they're just there almost symbolically because everybody kind of feels like they know what's going to happen. How could Band of Brothers stand up against this unbelievable force? And Band of Brothers figures out that this attack is coming. It's not hard to figure out that a crew of 1,200 ships is about to attack your territory. If you're an intelligence agent and you don't see that coming, you should probably be fired. And they post that they know it's coming, and they're trying to show off a little bit, and they say like, well, we even know what they're bringing. We're expecting 200 to 300 capital ships, 2 to 7 Titans, 5 to 25 motherships, and 5 to 10 support fleets of numbers at least 100 each. This was like a 1,000,000-man army compared to the real world. Like, this is an unbelievable, no one had ever seen what 200 or 300 capital ships looked like, let alone what it could do to a single capital ship assembly array. And so one goon FC, named Talone, if anybody knows who that is, replies, wow, not far off, and what are you guys bringing? And Sir Mole replies, our balls. And they do. The Battle of F-TEIT commences, and the Red Swarm shows up as a whole with all of their allies. On March 29th, 2007, the assault begins. And Red Swarm shows up with 190 dreads and 250 carriers, Titan, and again, hundreds of support ships, just many, many times the size of the Band of Brothers fleet, and they attack. And when they get into the system, they sort of pry their way into the system by sending in dreadnoughts first to tank all of the firepower and then getting the rest of their fleet into position. And what they find is Band of Brothers has set up all of their fleet defense around one shipyard. And so they attack directly into it. And they are unleashing just a complete torrent of destruction. Again, no one's ever seen what 200 dreadnoughts can do. And Band of Brothers is trying to repair this shipyard as the damage is incoming. But eventually they realize they can't. They just focus their strategy on making Red Swarm pay as much as they possibly can for this assault. And so they start bubbling up their dreadnoughts and trying to take down as many dreadnoughts as they can before this fight is over. And they managed to take down 40 dreadnoughts, which was, at the time, the most dreads ever lost in a single battle. But the inbuilt Titan is destroyed. And this is March 29th, so 2 days later, Sir Mully posts in the EVE Online forums, "You've done it. You have destroyed our Titan. Congratulations. We are humbled." And everybody is so jubilant about this that they're not paying attention to the date of the post, April Fool's Day. And what had happened was there were 2 shipyards in FTE-1T, and Band of Brothers set up their entire defense around the empty one. And so the shipyard that was destroyed was completely empty, and the Titan was being quietly built a few planets away while this battle raged. And this is an unimaginable disaster at the time, because remember, this is Band of Brothers the Invincible, the one that everybody worried was the greatest fleet that had ever been assembled and just could not be touched. And here they were, proving them correct. This made Red Swarm look quite foolish as well. So if you're wondering, what side am I going to join at this point? You're probably thinking, maybe I should join Band of Brothers. Maybe, even though we hate them, maybe we should join them instead. Do we have how much time do I have? Because we have I could talk for like an hour and a half more about this, but I'm curious. The clapping doesn't matter. Other people have presentations. Is there somebody around who can give me a 2 minutes? Well, no, so basically, this is a really good ending point because this leads to basically the outpouring of the Great War, where Band of Brothers is incredibly confident, and they begin to push back. The first time in a year that Red Swarm had actually been stopped in their pursuit through the south, Band of Brothers finally stops their momentum and begins to push them back, and Red Swarm's empire begins to recede. And this is really where things heat up in the Great War, and it becomes even more interesting. And so this, as I said, is about 1/6 of what goes on here. I hope you guys appreciate that I didn't come up and rehash the presentation I already had, even though this ends on a horrible middle finger cliffhanger. But it did too, yeah. That's my marketing strategy, man. But that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you guys so much for coming and for being an attentive audience. I really appreciate it. So